Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. This week we're going to service this Specialized Tarmac. We're going to give this a full service. We're going to put a new chain on this one, a new cassette. We're going to do some details, and it's surprising the amount that went on during this pretty routine service, but you'll see that there are a couple of things we did here that make a massive difference to this bike. Initially, you can see here the chain is worn out, so we do need to replace this chain. This bike is running Sram eTap, so we must make sure that we keep that to its absolute optimum. So we're going to put a new chain on, and also we're going to replace the cassette because the teeth on that have worn with that chain wear as well. The customer had also noted that he was having trouble shifting this bike, and we'll show you why that was as we're doing this service. We had this over tightened cassette ring on this one. We actually had to use a lever. It took me a couple of attempts before I was actually able to get that off with a breaker bar. So this was way over tightened and could have damaged the hub, but thankfully it hadn't done. And you can see here, not too much problems with this rear derailleur, but it is beginning to build up the old grease and oil on there. So we'll make sure we'll clean those jockey wheels off and get this lubricated and running nicely for the new chain, and to make sure that this bike is running absolutely at its best. So we're also going to take off all the components on this service. This is a pretty standard thing that we do in the shop, so we're going to get everything off and clean it all up. You can see here, not too much wear, not too bad, but it doesn't harm to take these components off and just check them through, as we did with these brakes. And we actually found that these brake pads were a little bit tired, which again we'll show you as we're doing this. So out come the pads. We'll get all that caliper cleaned up, and you can see here there's a lot of scoring on those pads. They were very thin, and actually on this top edge here, it doesn't show too well there was actually a ridge where the disc had worn a ridge on that pad material, and they were life extinct. They needed replacing, which kind of ties up with the chain being worn as well. So I took out the bottle cages there because we're going to lubricate the bolts that hold those on, and also wash down the frame. And now we're going to get the rear derailleur apart. I'm going to use a brake cleaner on these jockey wheels because it evaporates out, so I don't want to get any cleaners in the bearings of these, because the bearings were absolutely perfect. And you'll notice today no ultrasonic cleaner, quite a rare one for us on a video, but we're going to actually wash these down with warm soapy water, get off any of the grease that's on there before we continue with the lubrication process. Fortunately for us, these components weren't that dirty. The customer does keep this bike quite nicely, so we can just wash these down, get off the debris that is on these components before we do actually then clean them up. Also cleaned up the bottle cages there. Doesn't do any harm to do that as well. The fact they're off of the bike. And then I'm just going to use a little bit of Loctite on these axles for the jockey wheels to make sure they don't come off once they're back on the bike. You can see there that component is already beginning to look very nice. So I'm going to put a little bit of thin oil on the pivot points there, and then we're going to do the same on the front derailleur, and then we will use our premium grease on the return spring there to make sure that's nice. And the same with the through axle, a little bit of thin grease on the end on the brass bush, general purpose grease along the shaft, and copper grease on the threads. Now here is the reason why you service a bike. We had two of those bolts holding that chain set together were loose, so we torqued those up correctly so that they don't continue to come loose and spoil the bike. Next up, we wash down the frame. We're using our big softy brush there. It's a nice soft bristled brush to help wash that bike down, get this debris off, and it gets in all the nooks and crannies. So nice brush to do that process with. Wash down the saddle, make sure we get everything nice and clean. Doesn't do any harm to clean a bike when we service it. We can sometimes spot problems and things along the way, and one of those was here. This would have originally been a guide for a cabled front derailleur. It's no longer in use. The water would run down that frame, pour in that hole, fill up the bottom bracket, or potentially block the drain hole in the bottom there. So we're going to use one of our vinyl stickers here. We've got these in various different sizes on an A4 sheet, and we've just picked out a little circle there to put over that hole to cover that and to stop any debris getting down into that hole. So they're available on our website to buy. The link is in the description. We ship to the UK and worldwide, so it's definitely worth a look. Next up, I'm going to clean this hub. I needed to check those threads weren't damaged where that cassette was over tightened. They were showing a little bit of stress from that, but it will absolutely be fine to continue the journey on this bike. And then I'm also going to sand down the disc. These were very scored, the rotors, as were the pads. So the rotors were okay, they'll still be able to be used, so I just sanded those down. And then I'm going to lubricate the free hub body before I put on the new cassette. So we'll tighten that up and then we'll torque that up to make sure that's absolutely spot on and not over tightened. And then also need to rotate the tyres. One of those things that we like to do, we like to line up the valve with the logo on the tyre. It's aesthetically pleasing, makes the bike present much better, but also when you're out on the road, if you do get a puncture, it helps you to determine where that puncture was in the tyre in relation to the tube and the hole that you've got. So on goes that tyre in the correct spot, inflated, and then once I've inflated that, I just run round visually, and I noticed here that we've got a little flint in that tyre. Now these are a very thin tyre on this bike, and that there is this rider's next puncture. So if I pull that out, which I'm doing there, it won't work through the tyre, it won't create a puncture on the next ride, and so we pop that away and that puncture is saved for the rider for next time. Now the issue we had here with the shifting not quite right, you can see here we've got a massive gap on our derailleur hanger alignment tool. The derailleur hanger itself was way out of alignment. I had noticed there was a scuff on the derailleur itself, so this bike had gone on the floor at some point, so we needed to realign that derailleur hanger. It wasn't too bad, so it wouldn't weaken it by realigning it, so we realigned that before we put the derailleur on, and that will actually help with his shifting along with our adjustments along the way. On goes the chain set, torqued up. On goes the front derailleur. Again, we align the alignment marks that are on these derailleurs. They're actually quite nice that they do have little markers to align, and once you get used to using those, you can get these back in their correct position and do a little adjustment. And then we're also putting in new brake pads into the calipers, so I use a little bit of copper grease on the back of those to stop any corrosion between that and the piston. And it's also very important to lubricate those pivot pins, especially the threads. Notorious for binding. A lot of problems are caused on any manufacturer's rear caliper if that thread there is not lubricated. They all end up corroding, be that Sram or Shimano or any other brands, if you don't lubricate that. So I always make sure I lubricate those. So we're now getting the bike back together. In go the wheels. I'm putting a little bit of copper grease in the accessory bolt holes there. We'll stop those corroding in there. And again, that's a problem that can happen where they're not used or not altered, and they can corrode in, and then when you do want to swap out your bottle cages, you can't. On goes our chain, our nice new chain, and it's got this lovely flat top chain on this one. So I check the gears are going through, make my adjustments, and I'm happy now that that is shifting gear absolutely spot on, front and rear derailleurs. Check the brakes. I adjusted the calipers because they were catching slightly on that disc, but after a recentering they pulled fine. Away we go now with the torque wrench. So first of all, we're going to torque up these hoods. Now again, the next set of bolts here were very loose. This one especially, the bottom two on this were very loose, so we could have had an issue with the handlebars dipping down, but that in itself is worth the service, as is the seat on this one. So I'm going to go right through the bike, go front to back, calipers, headstock, stem, pedals, derailleurs, everything on this service is torqued. And again, look at this seat post clamp, very loose, as was the saddle clamp on this one. So this rider, not only would he have had a puncture from that tyre, he had the potential, if he was doing 100-mile sportive on this bike, that saddle would have come loose in that period of time with how loose it was. He'd have either had the saddle dropping or the saddle moving, and this service was worth it for those components alone. So you can see here, typical routine service, looking great, and I'm sure you've enjoyed this video. Do check out our website. We sell the big softies and the vinyl stickers and the greases and everything on there. The link is in the description below. Like and subscribe, and we'll see you again next week. Bye for now.